The November wind off the Powder River breaks carried ice in it that year, the kind that found the gaps in a wool coat before a person even stepped fully off a porch. The sagebrush along the high flats had already gone the color of old bone, and the creek below Harlan's crossing ran slower each morning, thickening at the edges the way creek water does when it has finally accepted what is coming. Nora Vass stood at the edge of the draw and looked down into it. The dugout was not much to look at. A low earthen mound pressed back into the south-facing cutbank. A rough timber door hung crooked on iron strap hinges, a single chimney pipe rising from the sod roof at an angle that suggested the man who installed it had been working from memory rather than skill. Beside the door, a rusted tin bucket sat in the frozen mud. A child's handprint pressed into the dried clay above the lintel, the fingers spread wide and small. Behind Nora on the wagon seat sat her daughter, Clara, 7 years old, braids tight, eyes watching everything. Behind the wagon stood Harlan Vass himself, Nora's late husband's older brother, boots planted in the frozen caliche like a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Harlan was not cruel in the obvious way. He was worse than that. He was practical about other people's suffering. "The property line runs along the top of that draw," he said. His voice carried the flat patience of a man who had rehearsed this. "The ranch house and the south pasture belong to the Vass family holding, which means they belong to me now that Thomas is gone. This parcel here, the draw land and whatever Thomas built down in it, that was his own personal claim. Which makes it yours, I suppose." Nora did not turn around. She was still looking at the dugout. "Thomas built that for a root cellar," she said. "Thomas built a lot of things that didn't work out," Harlan replied. Clara shifted on the wagon seat above them but said nothing. She had learned in the months since her father died that certain conversations between adults required children to become very still and very quiet. "You're sending a woman and a child into a hole in the ground before hard winter," Nora said. Still, her voice carried no shaking in it. Something harder than anger lived there instead. Harlan pulled his coat tighter at the collar. "I'm returning what belongs to you. The deed is in your name. The Vass holding can't support 2 households through a winter this size." He paused. "There's a boarding house in town. The Whitmore place takes in women and children at reasonable rates." 8. "We'll manage," Nora said. Harlan's boots turned in the mud. "Suit yourself." He walked back toward his horse without looking at the dugout again, as though already erasing it from the portion of the world he was responsible for. Clara climbed down from the wagon and came to stand beside her mother. For a long moment, both of them looked down into the draw at the low earthen mound with the crooked chimney pipe and the child's handprint baked into the clay above the door. "Mama," Clara said quietly, "are we really going to live there?" The wind came across the flats again, cold, direct, indifferent. Nora reached down and took her daughter's hand. "Go see if Pepper needs watering," she said. She stood alone at the top of the draw for another minute after Clara led the horse toward the creek. The draw itself bent the wind. She noticed that. The sagebrush along the cut bank barely moved, while the grass on the flats behind her leaned hard to the north. Down in the draw, the air sat still and heavy, the way air behaved when something solid was holding it in place. Nora Vass had grown up in eastern Ohio in a house built by her grandfather, a man who had spent 30 years studying how buildings failed before deciding how to build one that wouldn't. He talked about heat the way other men talked about water. It moved, he said. It followed rules. And the most important rule was that it always went somewhere. The question was whether you were smart enough to decide where. Thomas Vass had been a good man and a poor builder. The ranch house that now belonged to Harlan was tight enough in summer and a sieve in winter. The root cellar Thomas had begun in the draw before his accident had never been finished, never been properly ventilated, never been sealed against the moisture that crept through earth walls when temperature swings drove condensation into the clay. Thomas had been building from effort rather than understanding. Nora crouched at the top of the draw and pressed her palm flat into the exposed soil of the cutbank, cold at the surface. But 6 inches down, where her fingers could reach along the edge of an old erosion crack, the earth held a different temperature entirely. Stable. Not warm exactly, but not winter cold either. The way her grandfather had explained it, the earth was a battery. It stored what the surface forgot. She stood up and walked down into the draw. The town of Harlan's Crossing had been named after Nora Vass's father, a fact that Harlan had never once found it necessary to mention because it was already understood. 300 people, a general store, a feed operation, 2 saloons, a church, and a land office that doubled as a post station on Tuesdays and Fridays. Nora drove the wagon in 4 days after moving into the draw. She needed lamp oil, canvas, a specific grade of gravel she had seen advertised in a supply catalog, and 2 lengths of pipe elbow joint for a ventilation modification. She had been designing in a sketchbook since the second night underground. Dora Whitmore ran the dry goods counter at the general store. She was a woman of 50, with the social authority of a town magistrate and the memory of a county clerk. She watched Nora set her list on the counter and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than silence usually did. "Heard Harlan put you down in Thomas's root cellar," Dora said finally, loud enough for the 2 men drinking coffee near the stove to absorb without appearing to listen. "I'm improving it," Nora said. "Improving a hole. Improving a structure built into thermally stable earth on a south-facing slope with natural wind deflection on 3 sides," Nora said. She said it quietly and without heat, the way her grandfather used to state engineering facts. Not arguing, just correcting the record. Dora wrote the lamp oil into the ledger. "The Whitmore house has a proper room available. Good timber walls. Stovepipe that draws clean." "Thank you," Nora said. "The gravel. Half-inch crushed. 2 sacks." One of the men near the stove shifted his boots. The other set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. Outside, as Nora loaded the wagon, she heard the words from inside through the thin board wall. She couldn't make out exactly which man said it. Didn't need to. The tone carried through pine board just fine without the specific words. Clara was waiting on the wagon seat with Pepper's reins in both hands, watching her mother's face as Nora climbed up beside her. "What did they say?" Clara asked. "Nothing that matters yet," Nora told her. They drove back toward the draw in the early afternoon light while the Powder River wind came across the flats at their backs, pushing them toward the cut bank, like something that had already made its decision about where they belonged. The old woman's name was Jessie Holt, and she lived 2 miles north of the draw, in a low stone structure, so integrated into the hillside that travelers sometimes mistook it for a natural formation until smoke came from the chimney. She was 71 years old, Arapaho on her mother's side, the daughter of a French trapper on her father's, and she understood the high plains the way most people understood their own kitchens from years of daily, practical intimacy. Nora had heard about her from the land agent in town, who mentioned her in passing as a curiosity rather than a resource. "Old Holt woman up on the north bench, lives in a rock pile, been there 40 years, probably crazy." Nora found her on a Thursday, splitting kindling outside the stone structure in air, cold enough to make every exhale visible. Jessie Holt set down the hatchet and looked at Nora for a long moment without speaking. "You're the woman in Thomas Vass's root cellar," Jessie said. "I'm improving it," Nora said. Something shifted in the old woman's eyes, not warmth exactly, more like recognition. The same look her grandfather used to get when someone asked the right question. "Come inside," Jessie said. The interior of Jessie's stone structure was small and dry, and held a heat that made no sense against the coldness of the air outside. No roaring fire. A small iron stove with a fire the size of a man's 2 fists burning inside it. Yet the walls themselves seemed to radiate something back. Nora pressed her hand against the stone nearest the door. "How long since the fire was built up?" she asked. "Yesterday evening," Jessie said. Nora looked at her. "Stone remembers," the old woman said simply. She poured water from a pot into 2 tin cups and handed one across. "What do you want to know?" For the next 2 hours, Nora showed Jessie the sketchbook, the ventilation angles, the moisture management trench she had dug along the east wall interior, the thermal mass calculation she had worked out from her grandfather's notes. The question she could not solve. The draw oriented the dugout well for passive solar gain through the timber door in daylight hours, but after dark, the cold air drainage down the cut bank created a pressure differential that was reversing her chimney draft, unpredictably. Jessie listened without once looking at the sketches. She listened to Nora's voice instead. When Nora finished, the old woman was quiet for a time that felt longer than it was. Draft goes wrong when the pressure outside drops faster than the pressure inside can follow, she said. Happens fast in draws. The cold air pools at the bottom of the cut after sundown, and it's heavier than what's in your pipe. Pushes the smoke back down. Nora was already writing. The answer isn't a bigger fire, Jessie said. Bigger fire makes more smoke. More smoke makes the problem worse when it reverses. You need a secondary vent. Low, not high. Low, on the cold side of the structure, so the cold air coming down the bank has somewhere to go beside your chimney. Nora looked up from the sketchbook. A bypass. Jessie picked up her cup. My first husband called it a relief valve, she said. He learned it from a Shoshone elder who had been building earth shelters longer than this territory had an English name. Nora wrote for another minute. Then she looked at Jessie directly. Why are you telling me this? The old woman looked back at her without blinking. Because you drew the right lines in that book before you walked through my door, she said. Most people who come to me want to be told they've been doing it right. You came to find out where you'd been doing it wrong. She set the cup down. That's the difference between people who survive difficult things and people who don't. Outside, the wind pushed a sheet of dry snow across the north bench with a sound like distant paper tearing. One more thing, Jessie said, as Nora rose to leave. Her voice had shifted slightly, carrying something heavier underneath it. If the bypass vent ices over in a hard storm, and it will, the smoke will go back down your chimney before you smell it. It doesn't announce itself. It finds you in your sleep. She paused, and something crossed her face that was not about Nora or the dugout at all. I had a granddaughter once, built her first shelter too tight, thought I'd taught her everything she needed. The fire between them made a small, settling sound. I had not. The word once sat in the air of the stone room, after everything else had gone quiet. Nora stood at the door for a moment without opening it. I understand, she said. Make sure you do, Jessie told her. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Nora Vass had done since helping her grandfather pour a stone foundation at 14 years old in Ohio mud. Every morning she woke before Clara and worked by lamplight before the girl stirred. Every evening she worked until the lamp oil ran low. Clara gathered the materials that required small hands in tight spaces, packing clay into wall cracks, pushing gravel deep into the moisture trench with a wood paddle, holding the tin pipe section steady while Nora fitted the bypass vent elbow joint through the lower north wall of the dugout. The bypass went in on a Tuesday. That night, Nora tested the draft with a piece of burning cedar held near the chimney base. The smoke climbed straight and clean. When the canyon wind came down the draw at midnight and pressure shifted outside, instead of reversing up the chimney, cold air moved in through the low bypass, and the chimney exhaust continued upward without faltering. Clara woke the next morning and noticed immediately that her breath was not visible inside the dugout. For the first time in 3 weeks, it wasn't. But Harlan's Crossing did not know any of this. And what Harlan's Crossing did not know, it filled in from imagination and the natural human tendency to confirm what it had already decided. Dora Whitmore told 3 customers in one afternoon that the Vass woman was keeping a child underground in conditions that would concern any reasonable person. She did not say it with malice. She said it with the authority of someone who considered herself the community's conscience and had spent enough years in that role to stop distinguishing between concern and judgment. The feed store owner, a wide man named Greer, mentioned to Harlan that he had heard the child wasn't attending the schoolhouse. Harlan nodded slowly and said nothing, which in Harlan's vocabulary meant, I'll handle it. He came up the draw on a Wednesday, carrying his rifle across his saddle and a look on his face that he probably called concern. Nora met him outside the dugout door. I want to see the girl, Harlan said. She's studying, Nora said. Dora Whitmore thinks from 30 feet away without looking directly, Nora said. Still quiet. Still no shaking in the voice. Clara is healthy. She is warm. She is reading McGuffey's third reader, and she has recently learned to calculate the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius temperature scales, which I doubt any child in the schoolhouse has been asked to do. Harlan stepped down from his horse. He stood at the top of the draw and looked at the dugout below with the expression of a man examining something that was confusing him against his will. "It's January, Nora. There's 2 feet of snow on the flat." "I know," she said. "We're fine." He stood there another moment. Then he went back to his horse without asking to come inside, which told Nora something important. He had come expecting to see obvious failure. Obvious failure would have given him permission to act. What he found instead was a woman standing steady in cold air, calm-eyed, with no evidence of crisis and no invitation to rescue her. Harlan Vass could not make himself ask to come inside a structure he had written off as a hole in the ground. That night, Clara set her McGuffey reader down and said, "Harlan doesn't like us." Nora was banking the fire into its nighttime configuration. Small, controlled, deliberate. "Harlan is afraid of being wrong," she said. "People who are afraid of being wrong sometimes act like they dislike the person who might prove it." Clara considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to things that feel important. "Are you going to prove it?" The fire settled. The earthen walls, packed 4 feet thick and sealed with the clay and gravel system Nora had refined through a month of iteration, held the warmth from the evening fire, the way good pottery held liquid quietly, without drama, without loss. "The winner will," Nora said. Jesse Holt came down from the north bench in the first week of February, on a morning when the sky had gone. The specific white, that means weather is not arriving, but has already arrived above the cloud base, and is deciding when to begin. She walked the 2 miles from her stone structure with a leather bag over one shoulder, and stopped at the top of the draw without coming down. "Pressure's dropping," she said when Nora came up to meet her. "Not regular dropping, the fast kind." Nora looked toward the north. The Powder River breaks had gone invisible. Not hazy. Gone. "How long?" Nora asked. "It's already happening," Jesse said. "You won't see it come because it's already here above you. Wind drops to nothing before it hits. That's the sign you need to act on, not wait for." The wind at that moment was, in fact, nearly still. After 6 weeks of constant northwest pressure, the stillness felt wrong in a physical way. The way silence feels wrong in a room where machinery has been running for a long time. Nora did not waste a moment after Jesse turned back toward the north bench. She hauled river stones from the creek in 2 trips, with the wagon before the creek access became unusable. She filled every bucket and pot and kettle with water, while the pump still drew. She reinforced the bypass vent mouth with a clay-packed timber collar she had designed 2 weeks earlier and not yet installed, working in the fading light while Clara passed tools and Clara's breath finally became visible again in the dropping temperature. She packed snow against the exterior north wall of the dugout the way Jesse had described not random snow, but layered snow, stamped firm, creating an insulating mass between the earthen wall and the direct wind that would come from the northwest. She doubled the gravel moisture bed depth along the interior east wall. She checked the bypass vent twice with the cedar strip. Then she moved Clara's sleeping mat to the deepest interior corner and stacked the spare wool blankets within reach of the basalt bench. No, she corrected herself, within reach of the clay-packed river stone shelf she had built against the south interior wall, the stones that had been absorbing heat from the evening fire for 3 weeks and radiating it back slowly through the night. She did not go to Harlan's Crossing to warn anyone. She had tried, once, to explain the thermal mass principle to Greer at the feed store, and he had laughed with the specific gentleness that men sometimes use to dismiss a woman who is saying something they don't understand. She had tried once to explain the bypass vent concept to the schoolteacher, a young man from Missouri named Patterson, who had listened politely and then suggested she speak with the county land agent about proper housing standards. She was done explaining. Winter would do it better than she could. The storm came that night. It did not build gradually. It arrived in its full strength as if it had been waiting just beyond the ridge for the right moment, and then simply stepped forward. Wind drove snow so hard and flat across the high flats that it looked more like moving ground than falling sky. The draw filled from the rim in the first 2 hours, drifts stacking against the north wall of the dugout in white ridges that groaned under wind pressure. Inside, Nora fought for the system the way a person fights for something they have learned well enough to trust. Every 3 hours, she checked the bypass vent. Twice, it iced partially, and she cleared it with the iron rod she had placed beside the door, specifically for this purpose. The first time she went outside in the dark, the wind took her sideways 3 feet before she found the wall with both hands. Snow had packed itself so densely against the door that she had to push with her full weight to get back inside. She kept the fire small, always small. The temptation in a storm that size was to build the fire large, to fight the cold with volume. But her grandfather had spent an afternoon once explaining why that was the wrong instinct. A large fire in a sealed structure consumed oxygen faster and increased pressure differential between inside and outside, which made draft reversal more likely, not less. A small, steady fire fed a small, steady exhaust. The mountain, the earth, did the rest. Clara woke twice in the night. The second time, she came to sit beside her mother near the riverstone shelf and pressed her small hand against the clay-packed surface. "It's still warm," Clara said. She sounded surprised even after weeks of witnessing it. "It remembers the fire from earlier," Nora said. "How?" Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the controlled flame move under the shale cap she had fitted above the fire pit to direct heat sideways into the stone mass rather than straight up the chimney. "The same way you remember being warm even after the blanket falls off," she said. "The warmth doesn't leave all at once. It leaves slowly if you gave it somewhere to stay." Clara thought about this with the same seriousness she brought to arithmetic. Outside, the storm continued for 2 full days. The draw disappeared. The wagon disappeared. The creek, as far as Nora could tell, when she climbed out to clear the vent on the second morning, no longer existed as a visible feature of the landscape. Everything was white geometry, driven and reshaped by wind into forms that had nothing to do with the ground underneath. The Vass ranch house, a 1.5 miles south on the flat, had good timber walls and a properly sized iron stove and a wood rack Harlan had filled in October. It also had a chimney that topped out 8 feet above a roof that was now under 4 feet of wind-driven snow, with another foot packing against it every hour. Buried chimneys didn't draw. Stoves without draw didn't burn. And a house that didn't burn in a February storm on the Powder River high flats went cold in ways that proper timber walls could not prevent, because timber, however well fitted, was not the earth. It did not remember warmth. When the fire stopped, the cold came back immediately and completely, and it came in through every plank gap and floor seam, with the patient thoroughness of something that has been waiting outside for exactly this opportunity. Harlan Vass understood this by the end of the first night. By the end of the second morning, he understood it at a different level entirely. On the third day, the storm broke above the high flats the way some storms do not gradually, but in a single hour, as though the sky had simply lost interest. Wind dropped to a cold murmur. Light returned. The snow that had been moving horizontally settled to the ground and stayed there. Nora came outside and stood at the top of the draw in air that felt almost gentle after 2 days of violence. The Powder River basin below her was a white altered world, contours she had memorized replaced by new geometries she didn't recognize. Drifts stood as tall as fence posts where there had been open pasture. Tree lines that had framed the valley were buried to half their height. The wagon road to Harlan's Crossing had ceased to exist as a road. She looked south toward the Vass holding. No smoke from the chimney. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went back inside and told Clara to put on every layer she owned. The walk to the Vass ranch house took nearly an hour through drifts that came to Nora's hip in the deepest cuts. She used the iron rod as a probe ahead of each step, the way Jessie had described testing hard crust for hidden drop-offs beneath. Clara stayed close behind, stepping in the holes Nora made, both hands occasionally gripping the back of her mother's coat. Pepper couldn't be used. The snow was wrong for a horse. When the ranch house emerged from the white, Nora saw what she had expected and hoped not to see. Drift against the front door to the windowsills. Chimney buried under packed ice. No tracks, no activity, nothing moving around the structure at all. She hammered on the door with the iron rod until it opened. The cold that rolled out of the Vass ranch house was the same temperature as the cold outside. Sometimes worse interior spaces that had gone cold in a hard storm held a specific damp cold that outdoor air didn't have, the cold of walls that had given up their stored heat and then absorbed the chill that replaced it. Harlan was at the kitchen table, wrapped in 2 coats and a canvas tarp. Ruth, his wife, sat beside the stove wrapped in everything she owned, holding a coffee tin she had been heating on the stove surface before the last fuel burned down. Both of them were conscious. Both of them were past the point where a person argues. Harlan looked at Nora in the doorway. His eyes moved to Clara, standing behind her. He looked at the child, healthy, red-cheeked from the walk, but bright-eyed. None of the slow-blinking, confused look of someone who had been cold too long. "The dugout held," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Nora said. Ruth put her face in both hands. Her shoulders shook once, and then she controlled it the way frontier women controlled most things, with the simple application of will over what they allowed to show. Harlan looked at Nora for a long moment. The man was exhausted in a way that went past physical. There was something else in his face, something that looked like the specific tiredness of a person who has been certain about something important for a long time and has just run out of reasons to stay certain. "I can't take charity," he said. Old words. The kind a man says because he has said them so many times, they come out before he decides to say them. Nora looked back at him without triumph, without anger, without anything that looked like satisfaction. "Thomas would have wanted his daughter to know her family," she said. That was all. The silence in the frozen room was complete, except for wind brushing the exterior walls with a sound like dry grass moving. Harlan reached for his coat. The walk back to the draw nearly finished what the storm had started on Harlan and Ruth. Nora went first with the iron rod. Clara stayed beside Ruth, one hand at the woman's elbow on the bad drifts. Harlan came last, and twice Nora looked back to see him stopped, with his hands on his knees, breathing in the way men breathe when they are asking their bodies for more than their bodies want to give. They reached the dugout as the afternoon light went thin and gray across the basin. Nora pulled the door open. Harlan stopped just inside the timber throat section Nora had built to hold the transition zone between exterior cold and interior warmth. He stopped the way people stop when something contradicts what they have been carrying in their mind as settled. The air was dry, not the false dry of an overheated room with a roaring stove and burning walls. This was a different quality stable dry, the kind that didn't sting the sinuses or make the eyes water. The warmth came from the walls more than the fire. The fire itself was small and controlled, cedar burning clean, exhaust moving straight up through the shale cap and out the chimney without a trace of smoke in the interior air. Clara's coat hung drying on the line Nora had stretched through the rear interior, still faintly steaming. The water bucket near the earth bench was unfrozen. 2 pairs of wool socks dried against the river stone shelf, warm to the touch. Harlan walked slowly into the interior and looked at everything the way a man looks at something he has been wrong about. He stopped beside the river stone shelf and rested one hand against the packed clay surface, still warm. Hours after the fire had been small, he stood with his hand against that wall for longer than he probably realized. Ruth sat down on the sleeping mat. Clara brought her and accepted the tin bowl of broth Nora ladled from the pot without speaking. She drank it with both hands, and her eyes closed, and her breath slowly came back to its normal rate. Harlan eventually sat as well. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, he spoke quietly, to no one in particular, studying the ceiling where the low cedar pole structure Nora had built to trap rising heat in the upper chamber was still radiating warmth back downward. "Thomas never finished this," he said. "No," Nora agreed. "What it is now?" He stopped, started again. "What you built down here, that's not what Thomas started." "No," she said again. Harlan was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the basin with the subdued sound of a storm that had spent itself completely and was now only memory moving through the draws. "I told the whole valley this place would kill you before spring," he said. Nora did not answer. "I told myself it too," he said. That was the harder admission. A man can be wrong about other people. Being wrong about himself requires a different kind of accounting. Clara had fallen asleep against Rook No, against Pepper's old saddle pad that served as a floor cushion near the stone shelf, one arm curled underneath her head. The girl's breathing was slow and even and completely untroubled. Harlan looked at her for a long time. "What do you need fixed on the vent collar?" he finally said. "The outside fitting. I can see from here it's going to pull loose come the next heavy melt." Nora looked at the bypass vent collar. He was right. She had known it for a week, but the storm had arrived before she could address it. "Needs a wider timber plate behind the clay packing," she said. "And a second iron spike on the upper edge." "I can do that," Harlan said. The snow road to Harlan's Crossing opened again 9 days after the White Divide storm, which was what people in the Powder River Basin had begun calling it by then. Road crews from town worked inward from both ends, with shovels and teams, and by the time the main street became passable again, the shape of certain conversations in the general store and at the feed operation had shifted in ways that nobody announced, but everyone understood. Nolan Patterson, the school teacher from Missouri, came up the draw on a Tuesday carrying McGuffey's fourth reader for Clara and a set of questions he said were purely professional curiosity about the earth shelter ventilation design. He stayed 3 hours and left with 6 pages of notes and a different expression than he'd arrived with. Greer from the feed store came 2 days later. He brought split cedar. He did not explain why. He just stacked it outside the throat wall and nodded at Nora and went back down to his wagon. The cedar was good quality. The split was clean. It was the kind of cedar a man selected from his best stock rather than his leftover pile. Dora Whitmore came on a Friday. She stood just inside the threshold and looked at the interior for a long time without speaking. The water unfrozen in the bucket, the drying clothes on the line, Clara reciting multiplication tables from her mat, while the earth walls held 60 degrees of warmth around her in weather that had not risen above 15 outside all week. Dora looked at the river stone shelf, at the bypass vent pipe, at the drainage gravel floor system, at the low ceiling heat pocket formed by the cedar pole structure that captured rising warmth and held it close to the sleeping area. She said very little. Most people who came to the dugout that week said very little once they were inside it. The place argued its own case more clearly than Nora ever could have. On the last Friday of February, Harlan Vass came up the draw with 2 ranch hands and spent the afternoon refitting the bypass vent collar with a wider timber plate and 3 iron spikes instead of 2. He did not bring an apology, because apologies were not the language frontiermen spoke easily. He brought the right tools and the right materials, and he did the work without being asked to explain himself, and Nora understood that this was what he had available to offer in place of the words he could not find. When he finished, he stood outside the dugout entrance in the late afternoon light, looking north toward Jesse Holt's stone structure on the bench above them, barely visible as a dark line against the white hillside. "Whose design is the vent work?" he asked. "Jesse Holt's principal," Nora said. "My application." Harlan was quiet. "People in town say she's—" He stopped. "I know what people in town say," Nora said. He nodded slowly. Whatever he was going to add, he kept it. He put his tools back in the saddlebag and climbed onto his horse and looked down at Nora standing in front of the low earthen structure pressed into the south-facing cut bank, the chimney drawing clean smoke in a straight line above the snow-covered roof. "Conrad," he started, using his own father's name by mistake the way exhausted people do, then correcting himself. "Thomas. Thomas would have been glad to know you were here," he said. It was the truest thing Harlan Vass had said in months, and both of them understood it, and neither of them made it into something larger than it was. Jesse Holt died in early April, when the snowmelt water was still running cold beneath the eastern rocks above the basin. She died in her stone structure, in her sleep, in a room that still held warmth from the previous evening's fire. Nora buried her on the north bench above the draw, on a high flat that faced southeast, where the morning light arrived first each day. The grave marker was stone, set without mortar the way Jesse's walls had been set fitted pieces, each one selected for how it met the next. Clara put a single river stone on top of the marker without explaining why. Some gestures make their own meaning. Spring came the way it comes to the Powder River high country, not warmly or gently, but honestly. Snow receded, ground emerged, creek levels rose and fell according to temperature rather than storm. Harlan gave back the south pasture parcel. He did it through the land office, formally, with a filed deed adjustment, and when Nora received the paper, she sat with it for a long time before setting it on the earth shelf beside the lamp. Clara asked what it meant. "It means the draw land connects to the valley now," Nora said. "Are we going to build a house?" "A regular house?" Nora looked at the walls of the dugout, 4 feet of packed earth sealed with clay, a thermal mass that had carried them through the worst February in a decade. The river stone shelf that still faintly remembered heat even in April. The bypass vent with its new timber plate and 3 iron spikes, drawing clean and steady. Someday, maybe, she said, but not yet. Clara accepted this with the practicality of a child who has spent a winter learning that things most people dismiss are sometimes the only things that matter. In the summers that followed, travelers through the Powder River Basin would occasionally ask in Harlan's Crossing about the woman in the draw and the earth shelter built into the cut bank. The answers they received had changed completely from the answers the same question would have drawn 2 years earlier. By the late 1890s, they had stopped calling it the Vass Dugout. They called it the Warm House. Freighters caught by early blizzards knew where the draw was. Homesteaders whose timber cabins failed in hard winters sometimes showed up at the entrance, half frozen, and left 2 days later with color back in their faces, and the specific, thoughtful expression of people who had been wrong about something and were still working out the implications. Nora never turned anyone away. Clara grew into a quiet woman with her mother's hands, and Jessie Holt's patience for the way knowledge moved between people who were willing to teach and people who were willing to learn. She could calculate thermal mass ratios in her head before she was 12. She understood moisture management and draft pressure and the deep ground temperature principles that made earth shelter viable in climates that killed the unprepared. Harlan came by most Sundays after church, until his knees made the draw trail unreliable. He always brought something oil, hardware, split cedar from his best stock, never speeches, never the specific apology that the situation probably deserved in a strict moral accounting, but always the right material, always well chosen, always enough. On an October evening, years later, Nora sat outside the draw entrance and listened to the wind moving through the high flats above her. Inside, Clara was explaining draft flow to the young daughter of a homesteading family who had arrived 3 days earlier from Missouri with everything they owned in a wagon that had shed a wheel in the last creek crossing. "The earth doesn't fight the cold," Clara was saying. Nora could hear her voice clearly through the bypass vent opening, carrying the words the way good ventilation carried everything cleanly, without loss. "It just holds what it already has. If you give it enough warmth to hold, it keeps it long after you'd expect. That's the whole idea." The wind across the flats carried the smell of frost already. Not tonight, maybe tomorrow, but close. Nora pressed her palm into the earth of the cut bank the way she had on the first day, when everything had looked like failure waiting to happen. The surface was cold. Deeper, where her fingers reached into the stable earth below the frost line, the temperature hadn't changed at all. It never did. That was the thing most people never stopped to understand. In that country, the people who survived weren't always the strongest or the loudest or the best supplied. Sometimes they were simply the ones who had learned to listen to what the ground already knew and to build their lives accordingly. Sometimes the world hands you the hardest ground and calls it worthless, but what looks like a punishment can become the very thing that keeps the people you love alive. Nora didn't survive that winter by being louder or stronger than everyone who doubted her. She survived by paying close attention to what was already there and trusting it. The right knowledge, in quiet hands, is enough. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you an entertaining listen while leaving behind something worth carrying, a warm and genuinely useful lesson about resilience and trust in your own understanding.